Hi, I'm Kayla, and today we're going to do a general introduction to biology. So let's start with the basics. Bio stands for life. And ology means the study of, and you've definitely heard it in other contexts. So biology is quite simply the study of life, which is really, really broad and covers a lot of subtopics. One theme that we'll be talking about in this class is the difference between structure and function. So if you can, take a minute and pause the video and try to think of words that you associate with structure and words that you associate with function. When I ask this to students in class, a lot of times when we think about the word structure, we think about if we were thinking about a house, it'd be like the foundation, the walls, what something's made of. Whereas function, it's kind of hard to think of without actually saying the word function, but it's like what something does. A lot of times we think of the word purpose or some sort of emergent property. So when we start learning about biology, we often start to focus on structures, and then we'll link functionality to those structures. And like I said, biology is a really massive field of study. Like there are so many subdisciplines within biology. So if we're starting off in general biology 1, like your first biology class, we start at the smallest structure. So we literally start with chemistry. And a lot of times people are surprised, like, why am I learning chemistry in this general biology course? Well, it's because chemistry is the basic building blocks that help us learn about biology on a larger scale. So we'll be starting with the basics of what is an atom. So going really, really tiny and even talking about subatomic particles. And atoms come together to form molecules. We'll be talking about the main biological macromolecules. And if that sounds unfamiliar, you've actually probably heard of them. If you've ever looked on a nutrition label, you'll see the macromolecules, lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and then nucleic acids, but those aren't usually on your nutrition label. From there, you can scale up, and molecules make things like the biological molecules, but also organelles. These would be small structures that you find inside of a cell. So it makes sense that our next level up is cells. If we think about the human body, your whole body is made up of like billions and billions of cells. And there's different types of cells, like your red blood cells, your skin cells, your liver cells, et cetera, et cetera. Cells come together to make tissues. So you kind of inherently know that your muscle tissue and your skin tissue look very different, but on a basic structural level, they're made up of cells that all have similar structures themselves and perform a certain function. Like the function of your skin is quite different from the function of your muscles. Next up, we have organs and organ systems. So if we kind of keep with this theme, you have certain muscle cells, and all of those muscle cells come together to form muscle tissue and create my whole musculoskeletal system along with bones. Or an organ could be like a liver or the heart, also made up of muscular tissue in the case of the heart. Now, all of those organs come together and create an organism, which some of us have heard that word before, but sometimes you realize like, oh, an organism is made up of organs. It kind of makes sense. They all come together and you start to get onto a even larger and larger scales. So we have organisms, populations, and communities. A population, think of like, oh, the population of Denver, Colorado. When I say that, you know that I'm talking about one species. So there's populations of singular species, and then those different species and populations of species comes together to form communities. And then on a larger scale, we've got ecosystems. So ecosystems are taking into account all of those communities of living things, but then taking into consideration non-living aspects of that community as well, like your bodies of water, air, climate, etc. And then the biosphere, so we get as big as we can get. And in this class, if you're taking General Biology 1 with me, we kind of stick on the smaller level to start. So we start with those atoms and we build our way up to organism. And then if you're going to be taking a General Biology 2 class, that's where we pick up and talk about things like populations, communities, and ecosystems. So let's think about our first existential question of the day. What makes something alive? And I always say pause the video, and I think sometimes people are like, I don't want to. But I really suggest you do and let yourself think about it, because it seems obvious, but then when you try to come up with a definition, it gets quite difficult. The more I think about this question, actually, the more I'm convinced that there's no distinction between living and non-living, which is a very silly thing to say, but it's a fun brain game. So maybe you're thinking of things like, well, living things have energy that flows through them, right? Or living things have certain functions, like they can perform a certain function. Or maybe you're thinking on the structural side. So when we think about what makes something alive, like I mentioned, we usually jump to functions. And if you think about the functions that a living thing has, I mentioned energy flow, right? There's energy that flows through the system. And another word that might be associated with this is that it has a metabolism. We think of metabolism usually in the context of like, oh, what I ate in a day and how fast I digest it. But metabolism is actually all of the chemical reactions inside of a living thing. So it's much broader than that. So energy flows through living things. They also maintain a steady state, homeostasis. Living things also reproduce. That could be sexually or asexually, but humans make more humans. Bacteria make more bacteria. And in that way, there's this genetic component that's getting passed on throughout generations. So we have metabolism, reproduction, responds to the environment. So living things respond. If we're hot, we feel hot and we start to self-regulate. Kind of ties into homeostasis. Or there's certain chemicals that like bacteria and microbes are attracted to that they're sensing in their environment. Sometimes this can be kind of tricky depending on what life form we're looking at, but there is some sort of environmental sensing in one way or another. So these are just some of the functions that you might think of for a living thing. And the fun part about it is sometimes we can find things that sort of have a gray area. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's a certain characteristic of life that scientists often fall back on. And it comes to cell theory. So this is when we shift from function to structure. It's a structural definition of life. And cell theory tells us that living things have cells. And that cells are the basic building block of life. Maybe you haven't learned what a cell is just yet, but think of it as this outer membrane made of phospholipids, and inside it has this watery environment filled with structures necessary for life, like ribosomes, which make proteins, and genetic material. And we'll leave it there for now. We also know that cells come from other cells. Some life is just one single cell. So here I have an amoeba. A bacteria is also a living thing. That's one single cell, but they still fit our functional characteristics, right? Like cells make more cells. They can reproduce. They have energy flowing through them. They respond to their environment. They maintain homeostasis, so like a steady state. They're made of cells, so they are living. So whenever you're not sure if there's a description of something, it's like, is that alive or not? Because surprisingly, there are examples of that in biology. If it doesn't have basic cellular structure, we consider it non-living. Let's try to apply that to what we've learned so far. So here's our schematic of the different levels of life in biology, or I should say different levels of structure in biology. Organelle is right here. Organelles are things like the nucleus, which holds DNA inside of a cell, or a ribosome, or the mitochondria. Is an organelle alive? So pause and think about it. So I'm going to say no. And it all comes back to cell theory, which we just talked about. An organelle is inside of a cell. It's smaller than a cell. It's a level below cell. It itself is not a cell, it's just like a part of it. And so it's not alive. Another way to think about this is a human. If I took my liver out of my body and said, is this alive? And it was just a liver is not alive. There's probably not the best example. But it's like a part of a living thing. So in a way, an organelle is a part of a living thing. It's a part of a cell. So the structure is smaller than cell. We consider it non-living. I also want to point out that not all cells look alike, because when you're learning basic biology, you often see a lot of diagrams that are very cartoonish because we don't have excellent real images of cells. We can do electron microscopy, which is pretty good, but a lot of times it's really grainy and a little bit hard to imagine. So we use diagrams like these as a way to envision these certain things. And because they're cartoons, a lot of times we forget that they're real. And we think of this like image of a basic cell as like the cell. So I just want you to remember that cells come in a variety of different shapes and forms and have different functions. So even with this is showing within the human body, we have things like nervous cells, blood cells, bone cells, fat cells, and they are wildly different in both structure and function. And then we learned that cells can also be living things like bacteria and archaea, or that amoeba, which was a eukaryotic single-celled microbe. So are viruses alive? Another question you should pause and think about. And if you're not sure, if you're like, oh, I don't even know what a virus is, then think about what it would have to be alive. Viruses are very diverse. There's different types, but generally speaking, all viruses have protein, so some sort of like protein coat, and they're also going to have inside of that protein coat some genetic information. And that's going to be in the form of DNA or RNA. So to answer if viruses are alive, you could start thinking about those functional characteristics. And this gets a little bit tricky because viruses actually, they can reproduce, right? They make more of themselves. They have to do it by hijacking your cells or another living thing's cells. So they're mooching off of a different system. But they do technically reproduce. There's evidence that they can respond to stimuli in the environment. So they show some of these really interesting characteristics of life. They also don't have their own metabolism, but they borrow their host's metabolism to make more viruses. It gets a little bit tricky. So then we start to think about that structural definition. Cell theory. Is a virus a cell? Hard to answer if you're not sure what a cell is yet. But since I told you they're just protein and then just genetic information, that's not exactly cell structure. It's missing a lot of cellular components. So we would say that no, viruses are not alive because of cell theory. They are not a cell, and a cell is the smallest unit considered to be alive. So when it comes to the cells, we have two types of cellular organization, and there's different names for them. So you might have seen this before, but there is the eukaryotic cell type. Organisms that have the eukaryotic cell type fall into the domain of life called eukarya. Then we have the prokaryotic cell type. And the domains of life, or big categories of life that fall under this umbrella, are the bacteria and the archaea. So bacteria and archaea, these two big groups of life, used to be called the prokaryotes, but it's actually super misleading. They're completely different branches on the tree of life. However, we still use the word prokaryotic when we're talking about cell types because they do have a pretty similar general structure, I'll say. So I would, again, pause the video and see what you can remember from your high school intro bio classes. If you're comparing this prokaryotic cell type to the eukaryotic cell type, how are they similar and how are they different? This is a topic we're going to dive further into in another video, but I want to get us thinking. So which taxonomic groups have this cell type? So we said that for the prokaryotic, it's the bacteria and the archaea. The eukarya have the eukaryotic cell type. And in eukarya, we have us, humans. So I should say more broadly, animals, things like fungi, plants, and more. Is there a nucleus? So the nucleus is an organelle that holds genetic information. We don't have that in the prokaryotic cell type, but we do for eukarya. This is a major distinguishing feature. What does the DNA look like and where is it? So we just said in the bacteria and archaea, the DNA is not housed in a nucleus, but there is DNA. And for eukarya, there's DNA and it's found in the nucleus. Do we have membrane-bound organelles? For the prokaryotic cell type, this is another massive distinguishing feature. No membrane-bound organelles. Membrane is made up of phospholipids. We'll learn again more about that later. But the prokaryotic cell type do not have them, whereas the eukaryotic cell type do. So one example you might have heard of in the past is the mitochondria. Super well-known organelle. It's bound by a membrane. Does it contain ribosomes? Here's a bit of a trick question because ribosomes are technically organelles. They have a really important function of helping create proteins, but they're not bound by a membrane. So everything alive has ribosomes. They're not membrane bound though. So when we say prokaryotic cells don't have membrane bound organelles, they still have ribosomes. And then when we're talking relative sizes, this is very broad and general speaking because the only rule in biology is that there's always exceptions. But generally speaking, the prokaryotic cell type, bacteria and archaea, are smaller, and eukaryotic cells are larger. So here's our tree of life, and taxonomy is the study of categorization of life, of naming things. So we can take all life and fit it onto this big branching tree based off of how similarly related things are in their evolutionary history. And the biggest, broadest level are the domains of life. So this is where we start. This is the biggest categorization, and then from there we can branch smaller and smaller and smaller. So our 3 domains of life include bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Remember, the bacteria and archaea have the prokaryotic cell type, and eukarya have the eukaryotic cell type. The reason I said prokaryote is a really misleading word, again, is because if you look at this history, bacteria evolved first, and then later the archaea, and then again later the eukarya. But if you look at genetic similarities and some other structural components, some archaea are more closely related evolutionarily and genetically to eukarya than they are to the bacteria. So it doesn't make sense to try to lump archaea and bacteria all together. So everything fits into this tree of life. We are in eukarya. In the animals, which is why there's a little star, you are here, right? We are animals. And then there's a bunch of other groupings with a huge diversity of life. So that was a very simplified tree of life. The tree of life can actually be almost impossible to look at if you tried to map all the diversity of life onto there. So that's going to be our broad introduction. Where are we headed next? So now we have some of the basics of just generally what is life, and you might be curious about some evolution in this tree of life in general. So we'll talk about this tree of life and how do we know how to structure it and where things go on the tree. And there's 2 ways to answer that. Broadly, we know because of science. So we're going to talk about what is science, what is the scientific method, and then we're going to talk about basic evolutionary theory that helps us construct this tree of life. And then a sneak peek later is going to be chemistry for biology. So just like we looked at that schematic of all the levels of structure, chemistry is really the smallest, and then we're going to learn the basics so we can work our way up from there. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again soon.